For decades, there was one image everyone agreed on: safe, charismatic, untouchable. A man who crossed generations without friction, who felt universally acceptable in a way very few public figures ever do. Parents trusted him. Studios relied on him. Audiences felt comfortable with him. His image wasn't just popular, it was stable. And stability is rare in fame. It took years to build that kind of reputation, countless performances, careful choices. A persona refined so well that it began to feel permanent, like something that couldn't be shaken by a single moment. Until it was. Because sometimes, image doesn't collapse slowly, sometimes it fractures instantly. One moment, broadcast live, replayed endlessly, dissected without mercy, can undo decades of narrative. Not because it reveals something new, but because it forces the public to reevaluate what they thought they understood. And when that happens, the damage isn't just reputational, it's symbolic. What made this moment different wasn't just what happened, it was where it happened. The stage, the timing, the expectations attached to that night. A setting designed for celebration, control, and performance, suddenly overtaken by raw reaction. No script, no edit, no distance. The world didn't just witness an action, it witnessed the collapse of an idea. The idea that certain people are immune to human error. That image, once perfected, protects itself. It doesn't. This is not a story about outrage or judgment. It's a story about perception. About how fast public identity can shift. About how one moment can overwrite years of consistency. And about what happens when a carefully constructed image meets something it was never built to handle. Because that night didn't just change how people saw him. It changed what celebrity safety even means. For years, Will Smith's public identity was not just admired, it was trusted. Trust is a rare currency in celebrity culture, and he had accumulated it carefully. His career was built on approachability, humor, emotional openness, and an almost deliberate absence of controversy. He wasn't just famous, he was safe to believe in. That safety didn't happen by accident. Every role reinforced it. The lovable outsider, the responsible hero, the man who wins without corrupting himself. Even when his characters struggled, they struggled with heart. Over time, those performances fused with his real-life persona. The boundary between actor and image blurred, and the audience stopped separating the two. This is how reputations harden. When a celebrity maintains consistency long enough, the public stops seeing behavior and starts seeing identity. Actions are interpreted generously. Mistakes are reframed as anomalies. The person becomes an idea, not just an individual. And ideas feel permanent. Will Smith became an idea. The idea of control, the idea of emotional intelligence, the idea of someone who had figured it out. That made what happened so destabilizing. Because the night that changed everything didn't introduce a new version of him. It introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous when an image is built on predictability. The public doesn't react most strongly to wrongdoing, they react to contradiction. This moment contradicted everything people thought they knew. The shock wasn't just about the action, it was about the mismatch between expectation and reality. People weren't prepared to reconcile the image they trusted with behavior that didn't fit the narrative. And when reconciliation fails, trust collapses quickly. That collapse was amplified by context. This wasn't a private mistake leaked later. It wasn't a rumor clarified over time. It was live, immediate, unfiltered. The audience didn't have time to rationalize or distance themselves. They experienced it in real time, alongside millions of others. That simultaneity mattered. Shared shock creates shared judgment. The internet reacted as a single organism, pausing, replaying, analyzing. Within minutes, interpretations hardened. Within hours, narratives formed. Within days, a new image replaced the old one. This is how modern reputation shifts happen. Not through investigation, not through reflection, through repetition. The same clip, the same freeze frame, the same moment stripped of complexity. What made the situation worse was the absence of familiar defenses. There was no irony to soften it, no humor to redirect it, no carefully worded distance. The tools that had protected Will Smith's image for decades were suddenly ineffective. because they were built for a different kind of crisis. This was not a scandal that unfolded slowly. It was an emotional rupture. And emotional ruptures don't respond to public relations logic. They demand explanation, accountability, and coherence, things that are hard to provide when the moment itself defies easy explanation. Another factor deepened the impact: investment. Audiences felt personally invested in Will Smith's image. His success felt collective. His story felt aspirational. Many people grew up with him, watched him evolve, trusted him to represent a certain kind of masculinity, confident without aggression, strong without threat. That investment turned disappointment into betrayal. When people feel betrayed, they don't just criticize actions, they reassess history. Old moments get reinterpreted. Past behavior gets re-examined. The narrative doesn't just pause, it rewinds. Suddenly, everything was up for question. Was the image ever real? Was it always performance? Was control just suppression? These questions surfaced not because the answers were obvious, but because trust had been broken. And once trust breaks, neutrality disappears. People feel compelled to choose sides, assign meaning, and reach conclusions quickly. This is the environment Will Smith found himself in overnight. Not judged for a single action, but redefined by it. The public no longer asked what happened. They asked what it meant. And meaning, once assigned, is hard to reverse. Especially when the moment becomes symbolic of larger conversations about masculinity, fame, emotional restraint, and public behavior. The incident stopped being personal, it became cultural. And when a celebrity becomes a symbol, they lose control of interpretation. Their intentions matter less than what the moment represents to others. That loss of control is one of the most destabilizing experiences public figures face. For someone whose career was built on managing perception through consistency, this was unprecedented territory. The image wasn't damaged because of violence alone. It was damaged because it contradicted a carefully constructed promise. And broken promises linger longer than broken rules. What followed was not just fallout, it was redefinition. And redefinition, once begun, does not stop at the moment itself. It spreads backward and forward, reshaping how everything else is seen. That night didn't erase Will Smith's past, but it changed how the past was read. And that shift marked the beginning of a new reality, one where the image he had spent decades building could no longer protect him from being seen as human in a way the public wasn't prepared for. That was the real turning point. And the consequences were only beginning. After that night, the most immediate consequence wasn't punishment or apology, it was silence. A heavy, unfamiliar silence that replaced the easy goodwill Will Smith had always operated within. Silence from institutions that once celebrated him. Silence from peers who didn't know how to respond. Silence from an audience that suddenly felt unsure. Silence is destabilizing for public figures. For years, Will Smith had existed in an environment of affirmation. Even criticism came wrapped in affection. After the incident, that tone changed. The world didn't just react, it hesitated, and hesitation signaled something important. The image people relied on to interpret him no longer worked. When an image breaks, the public looks for a new framework. Some framed the moment as loss of control, others as long-suppressed emotion, others as entitlement enabled by fame. None of these narratives were neutral. Each one pulled his identity in a different direction, and he could not control which one would dominate. That loss of narrative control is one of the most jarring experiences a celebrity can face, especially one whose career depended on being understood. What made recovery difficult was that the incident resisted simplification. It wasn't easily categorized as malicious or accidental. It didn't fit neatly into scandal playbooks the public was used to. It was emotional, impulsive, and public. That ambiguity frustrated audiences who prefer moral clarity. When clarity is missing, people project their own values onto the event. And projection multiplies damage. Will Smith became a canvas for debates larger than himself, about masculinity, emotional restraint, public boundaries, and accountability. The conversation quickly outgrew the individual. He was no longer just a person who acted, he was a symbol of conflicting cultural expectations. That symbolic weight made every response feel insufficient. An apology satisfied some and angered others. Reflection was interpreted as sincerity by one group and deflection by another. Silence looked respectful to some and evasive to others. There was no universally acceptable response because the public no longer agreed on what the incident represented. This is where reputational damage deepens. When a celebrity's meaning fragments, consistency no longer protects them. Every move becomes a signal. Every absence becomes suspicious. Every attempt to explain risks reinforcing a narrative they don't control. For Will Smith, this meant something he had rarely faced: irreversibility. In the past, any misstep could be absorbed into his broader image. This one could not. It had altered the framework through which everything else would be interpreted. Even positive actions were now filtered through doubt. The audience had lost its default generosity. That loss changed professional dynamics quickly. Projects stalled, invitations cooled, recognition became complicated. Institutions that once benefited from his image hesitated to associate with uncertainty. This wasn't formal exile, it was cautious distance. Distance is how reputations erode. Not through loud condemnation, but through hesitation, through unanswered calls, through opportunities that quietly disappear. This kind of erosion is harder to fight because it has no clear antagonist, and it forces a painful realization: image is not owned, it is borrowed from public trust. Once that trust fractures, rebuilding it requires more than time. It requires transformation, not cosmetic, but genuine, the kind that addresses why the image existed in the first place and what happens when it no longer serves. For Will Smith, the challenge was not to restore the old image. That image was gone. The challenge was to decide whether a new one was possible and whether the public would accept it. That decision is far more complex than recovery from scandal, because recovery implies returning. This was about redefinition, and redefinition is risky, especially when the audience is still watching the moment that caused the break, replaying it, interpreting it, and refusing to forget. That night didn't just change how people saw Will Smith, it changed what they expected from him. And expectation, once altered, reshapes every future interaction, on screen and off. This is the space he was forced to enter. A career no longer protected by familiarity, and an identity no longer cushioned by goodwill. What came next would determine whether that night was a permanent fracture, or the beginning of something more complicated. What followed was a period of forced introspection, one that celebrities rarely experience publicly, and almost never by choice. When the old image no longer works, the instinct is to repair it. To restore balance, to remind the public who you were supposed to be. But that option wasn't available here, because the moment didn't damage Will Smith's image at the surface level, it challenged the foundation underneath it. For decades, his persona had been built on emotional control, not suppression, but mastery. He presented a version of masculinity that was expressive yet safe, confident yet non-threatening. That balance was not accidental. It was cultivated through roles, interviews, public appearances, and carefully maintained boundaries. That night suggested something else existed beneath the surface. And once the public senses a hidden layer, curiosity turns into suspicion. People start asking what else they don't see. What's been held back? What's been managed? This is when admiration turns analytical. Will Smith was no longer being watched as a performer. He was being examined as a person. That shift changes everything. In the weeks and months that followed, the conversation moved away from the act itself and toward interpretation. Was it a moment of weakness, a breaking point, a reaction shaped by years of pressure, or evidence that the public image had always been incomplete? None of these questions had clean answers, and the absence of clean answers made the scrutiny relentless. This is the cost of building a reputation on consistency. Inconsistency becomes explosive. For someone whose career relied on being broadly relatable, this fragmentation was destabilizing. Different audiences projected different meanings onto the same moment. Some saw vulnerability, others saw entitlement, some saw courage, others saw failure. The public didn't agree, and disagreement is toxic to a unified image. More importantly, Will Smith could no longer control the pace of judgment. The incident became a reference point, brought up in unrelated contexts, attached to future work before it was even seen. Every new appearance felt like a test rather than a return. This is where many celebrities disappear. Not because they are cancelled outright, but because re-entry becomes exhausting. Every step forward requires explanation. Every project carries extra weight. The joy of creation is replaced by risk assessment. And risk assessment kills momentum. For Will Smith, the psychological impact of this shift was significant. A person who had spent a lifetime mastering public perception was suddenly stripped of that mastery. The rules he had played by no longer applied. Silence didn't calm things. Speaking didn't resolve them. The feedback loop had changed. That creates a rare kind of pressure. It's not the pressure to perform. It's the pressure to exist publicly while being redefined by others. To watch your identity be debated while you're still living inside it. To feel your past being rewritten in real time. This kind of pressure doesn't just affect career decisions. It affects self-perception. When the public narrative becomes unstable, people often question their own understanding of themselves. Was the image false? Was it incomplete? Or was the moment an anomaly exaggerated beyond proportion? These questions are disorienting, especially when asked under global scrutiny. Another layer complicated everything: responsibility. Unlike many celebrity controversies, this one did not involve denial. It required ownership. And ownership, while morally necessary, does not guarantee forgiveness. Sometimes it accelerates the transition from beloved figure to cautionary example. Owning a mistake does not undo symbolic damage. The incident had already been absorbed into larger cultural conversations about masculinity, violence, emotional expression, and public accountability. Will Smith became a reference point in debates he didn't initiate and couldn't exit. That is the danger of symbolic moments. Once a person becomes a symbol, their individuality fades. Nuance disappears. Complexity is flattened. The public uses the image to process its own anxieties rather than to understand the individual involved. This is why recovery is so difficult. You are no longer repairing your own reputation. You are negotiating with collective meaning. That negotiation requires time, distance, and restraint. Rushing back risks reinforcing the narrative. Disappearing too long risks irrelevance. There is no perfect timing, only calculated exposure. Will Smith's responses reflected this tension. Attempts at openness were scrutinized. Attempts at reflection were dissected. Attempts at humor were questioned. Every tone choice became a statement. The margin for error shrank dramatically. This is where the cost of one moment becomes clear. Not in punishment, but in permanence. The incident became part of his identity, whether he accepted it or not. It could not be erased, only contextualized. And context takes time, sometimes years, to form. The public rarely grants that patience willingly. What made this period especially challenging was that Will Smith's past success offered little protection. In fact, it worked against him. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall feels. The more goodwill accumulated, the more shocking its absence becomes. He was no longer being judged as an average public figure. He was being judged against an idealized version of himself. That comparison is unwinnable. Every attempt to move forward had to contend with that ideal. And every deviation from it was read as further confirmation that the image was flawed. This is the psychological trap of iconic status. Icons are not allowed to fail quietly. When they do, the failure becomes educational. A lesson, a warning. The public consumes it not just as news, but as proof that no image is immune. Will Smith's challenge was not simply to rebuild trust. It was to decide whether rebuilding was even the right goal. Because sometimes, the only path forward is not restoration, but acceptance of a new, more complicated reality. One where admiration is mixed with skepticism. Where legacy is layered rather than pristine. That transition is uncomfortable, but it is also honest. The question that remained was not whether the image could be fixed, but whether he was willing to live without it. And that question would define everything that came next. After the initial shock settled, a deeper shift took place, one that was less visible, but far more permanent. Will Smith was no longer operating inside a familiar relationship with the public. The unwritten contract that had protected him for decades had changed. That contract had always been simple: consistency in exchange for goodwill. As long as he remained predictable, emotionally controlled, and broadly likable, the audience would extend generosity. They would interpret his actions charitably. They would separate the person from the moment. That generosity evaporated after the incident, not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. People no longer knew which version of him they were interacting with. This uncertainty reshaped how everything he did was received. Where once his openness felt authentic, it now felt calculated to some. Where his silence once felt dignified, it now felt evasive to others. The same behaviors carried entirely different meanings depending on who was watching. This is what happens when an image fractures instead of fades. A fading image allows for nostalgia. A fractured image invites scrutiny. Will Smith entered a phase where neutrality was impossible. Every appearance was interpreted. Every word was weighed. Even attempts to move on were seen as statements. The public no longer allowed him to simply exist. He had to mean something at all times. That pressure is psychologically destabilizing. Most people experience moments of failure in private, where reflection can happen quietly and identity can adjust internally before being tested again. Will Smith's failure happened at maximum volume. There was no buffer between the moment and its interpretation, no space to recalibrate before the world responded, and the world responded aggressively. Commentary didn't just focus on the action, it questioned his marriage, his masculinity, his emotional health, his sincerity, his entire past. The moment became a gateway through which everything else was reevaluated. That kind of retroactive judgment is difficult to endure because it removes any sense of stable ground. Your history no longer belongs to you, it belongs to interpretation. This reinterpretation had a chilling effect on his professional identity. Roles he once would have stepped into effortlessly now carried added risk. Audiences would not watch him the same way. Characters would be filtered through the incident. Even fictional performances risked being read as commentary. This is where reputation damage becomes structural. It's not about whether people forgive you. It's about whether they can forget enough to engage freely again. For someone whose strength had always been emotional relatability, this barrier was significant. Relatability depends on ease, on trust, on the absence of distraction. Once the audience is distracted by unresolved meaning, connection weakens. That weakening is subtle, but powerful. Will Smith was still famous, still recognized, still discussed. But discussion without clarity does not translate into support. It creates distance. People observe rather than invest. They analyze rather than feel. This is the point where many public figures attempt to overcorrect. They explain too much. They apologize repeatedly. They offer access in hopes of regaining warmth. But overexposure after a fracture rarely repairs trust. It often reinforces the idea that the image is unstable. Will Smith appeared to recognize this, choosing a more restrained approach, selective engagement, measured reflection, and long periods of relative absence. Absence, however, carries its own risks. Silence allows narratives to harden. Without new reference points, the old moment remains dominant. Time alone does not dilute symbolism. Only replacement does, and replacement requires visibility. This created a paradox. To move past the moment, he needed to be seen again. But being seen meant reopening judgment. This tension forced a fundamental decision, whether to chase restoration or accept transformation. Restoration would mean trying to return to the old image, safe, controlled, universally agreeable. Transformation would mean allowing a new, more complex version of himself to exist publicly, even if it was less comfortable for audiences. Transformation is harder. It requires accepting that admiration may never return in the same form. That trust may be conditional. That legacy will be layered rather than clean. For someone who spent decades refining a singular image, this is a profound shift. Yet, it is also more sustainable. Icons who survive moments like this do not survive by erasing them. They survive by absorbing them into a broader, more honest identity, one that allows contradiction, one that tolerates discomfort, one that does not depend on being universally liked. Will Smith stood at that crossroads. He could continue defending an image that no longer existed, or he could allow a new one to emerge, less polished, less predictable, but more real. That choice does not happen overnight. It happens through restraint, patience, and acceptance of reduced control. It requires letting the public sit with unresolved feelings rather than rushing to resolve them. This phase of his story is not about redemption yet. It is about recalibration, about learning to live publicly without the shield of certainty, about understanding that legacy is not destroyed by one moment, but it is permanently altered by it, about recognizing that power built on perfection is fragile, while power built on complexity can endure. The night that changed his image did not end his career. It ended an era. What followed was not collapse, but a quieter, more difficult task. Deciding who he could be without the version of himself the world had trusted for so long. And that decision would determine whether the moment defined him, or simply became part of him. In the end, the night that changed Will Smith's image forever did not destroy his career. It exposed the limits of image itself. For decades, his public identity had been built on control, emotional, professional, symbolic. He represented a version of celebrity that felt safe in a world that rarely is. That safety created trust. And trust, once established, feels permanent. Until it isn't. What that night revealed was not a hidden villain or a sudden transformation. It revealed something far more uncomfortable. That even the most carefully constructed public selves are still human, and humanity does not always behave on schedule. The real impact wasn't the act. It was the loss of certainty. The certainty that some figures are immune to rupture. The certainty that consistency guarantees protection. The certainty that image, once perfected, can carry someone forever. That certainty disappeared in seconds. What followed forced a reckoning, not just for Will Smith, but for how we understand celebrity. The public often treats famous people as finished products, not evolving individuals. When that illusion breaks, disappointment turns into judgment, and judgment hardens into redefinition. Will Smith did not just lose goodwill. He lost the benefit of simplicity. His image became complex, layered, and unresolved. And unresolved identities make audiences uncomfortable. They demand patience, nuance, and restraint. Qualities modern culture struggles to sustain. This is why recovery from moments like this is never clean. You cannot go back to being trusted without question. You cannot return to innocence once it's gone. You cannot rebuild an image that depended on being unbroken. What you can do is adapt. Adapt to a public life where admiration is mixed with skepticism. Adapt to a legacy that includes contradiction. Adapt to a version of relevance that no longer relies on perfection. That is the quieter challenge Will Smith now faces. Not redemption as spectacle, not apology as performance, but acceptance of a more complicated truth. That one moment can alter perception permanently, even when it doesn't define character entirely. The night didn't erase his body of work. It reframed it. And reframing is irreversible. This story matters because it reveals something universal about modern fame. Celebrity is no longer about talent alone. It is about trust, expectation, and narrative stability. When any one of those collapses, the public responds not with patience, but with recalibration. Will Smith's experience shows how fragile that system is, and how quickly it can turn. If this story changed how you see celebrity, not as something protected by success, but as something constantly negotiated, then it has done its job. If it made you reconsider how unforgiving public judgment can be, even toward those we once trusted most, that matters even more. And if you want more long-form documentaries that examine the psychology, power, and consequences behind famous moments, beyond outrage and headlines, stay with this channel. Subscribe for deeper analysis. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. And share this video with someone who believes one moment can never outweigh a lifetime, because in the age of constant visibility, sometimes one night is all it takes to change everything.